yours.
Thank you very much, Boris, for inviting me. Thank you to the Post-Globalization Initiative, and thank you for coming to the event. I think the first thing that I would like to address is the nature of the crisis in the United States. So, as Boris suggests, we have not had the same kind of strict, heavy-handed austerity that we see, say, in the Baltic states, or in Spain, or in Greece, Portugal, or even the United Kingdom. When the crisis first broke out in the fall of 2008, the first response of the government was with a somewhat Keynesian set of policies to it. And this led my good friend Ha-Joon Chang, a South Korean economist at Cambridge University, to respond that this was, in effect, monetarism for the poor, Keynesianism for the rich. So two different sets of policies depending on how powerful you were in the global system. So the United States, still being a rich, powerful country, although that's becoming less and less convincing of a statement to make today, could pursue a Keynesian set of policies. It did so initially by bailing out its financial sector. Now, this, in effect, became a great welfare program, a great giveaway to Wall Street and the financial sector, rather than bailing out the indebted people of the working class and the middle class, which arguably would have been the more ethical policy, but also the better economic policy as well, in terms of creating demand from below to stimulate the economy. Instead, we saw a top-down approach to the crisis, which just flooded the financial sector with even more money. So it would be as if, let's say, you hired a builder to construct a house for you. They screwed everything up from the day one, and they said, well, sorry we screwed everything up, but maybe we can make things right. Why don't you give us 3 times the original price that we quoted you for constructing the house? And so the response of the United States government was to say, yes, okay. And in fact, why don't we give you 10 times as much? 3 times as much isn't enough. So they flooded Wall Street with these enormous sums of money in an effort to try and restore the economy. In effect, as the saying goes, the financial sector and its constituent individual banks, for the most part, were seen as too big to fail. Now, we let one big financial house go under. That was Lehman Brothers. But that's what started this big run. And it was decided that we couldn't have any more of these kinds of big financial institutions going under. Now, this chronology is important. That's why I'm going to go through the events that take us up to the present. And then perhaps we'll go back to the 1970s and look at the origins of the crisis from a kind of longer-term perspective. In the winter of 2009, there was a debate regarding how to further respond to the crisis. It was thought by many Keynesians in government and in policy-making circles among intellectuals that the failed ideas of neoliberalism were now fully visible for everyone to see. The emperor had no clothes, in effect, and everyone could see this. So it was thought these policies, these ideas were dead. Well, we were proved very wrong. In fact, I was proven wrong. I was one of those people who thought that, well, it's just so clear now that we cannot continue to pursue these policies that we will change. Well, no. So the response, the initial response to this crisis, after kind of cauterizing the bleeding wound by salvaging the banking sector, was to offer a stimulus, a Keynesian stimulus to the economy, to restore demand, and to help rebuild the economy and its failing infrastructure. The stimulus originally was argued should be somewhere in the range of 1.5 to maybe 2.5 trillion US dollars and should rebuild infrastructure. So just as with Russia, US roads, communication systems, and other types of infrastructure are, for the most part, in bad shape. Very bad shape. Now, we have to remember that when you don't spend money on infrastructure, it's expensive. So the classical economic tradition of the 19th century stated correctly that when you invest in infrastructure, it reduces costs in the economy. What it does is it makes it cheaper to conduct business. You spend less time trying to get your goods to market. You spend less time repairing your trucks, your automobiles, your trains. If you improve infrastructure, it actually saves money. And that you want the government to do this, because if you privatize it, then all that does is it makes you pay a rent, a fee, to a private firm that will charge you tolls for using that infrastructure, and that's an added cost or burden on the economy as a whole. So in a kind of inversion of how we think of free markets today, in the classical economic tradition, when they were referring to free markets, something we hear all the time, right, and we have for the past 20 years, you must free markets, you must have these markets freed from governmental control. The classical economists of the 19th century were talking mostly about freeing markets from private rent seekers, freeing it from toll charges and other kind of taxes that were, and by taxes I mean charges, private charges on the economy. And they were trying to take us away from the last vestiges, in effect, of feudalism, which essentially put all sorts of impositions and controls on the operation of markets. They were trying to free markets. So today's neoliberals, ironically, are taking us back to, in one sense, a kind of a feudal system, but one without any noblesse oblige. There is no responsibility to the poor or the working classes. Everyone's on their own. So it's a kind of a meaner version of feudalism. Now, the stimulus. There was widespread consensus that the stimulus was needed in the United States in the winter of 2009. But by the end of the winter, the Republican Party began to organize against it. Now, originally they were, again, in disarray. Ideologically, they were in disarray. They did not know how to respond to this crisis, because from their perspective, this crisis should not have happened. And so even if you take a look at the main organs of communication of the right wing in the United States, chiefly Fox News, which has the largest market share of any network in the United States, you could just smell the fear on them. They did not know how to respond to this, and they thought we were going to take this major left turn. They thought that Barack Obama was going to be this leftist who would change the country forever. Obama turned out to be a kind of a Eisenhower or a Rockefeller Republican, but that's another matter. The Republican Party began to organize against this stimulus. They didn't argue against the stimulus completely because they didn't have the congressional votes to do so. But what they said they wanted was the following. They wanted the stimulus smaller in size. Eventually, it was shrunk down to about 800 billion US dollars. So roughly a half to a third of what it could have been. Then the Republican Party wanted the stimulus to be chiefly tax cuts, not spending on infrastructure, but tax cuts. Now this is very important, because if you're not spending it on infrastructure, again, remembering that infrastructure would reduce costs on the economy as a whole, but if you use tax cuts instead, that money can go in any number of directions. Some of it will be put into consumers' pockets, and they will spend it for goods and services. That does have a stimulus effect. But it can also be used to purchase goods from abroad, and then that represents an exit of capital from the United States and a reduced stimulus effect. So the stimulus impact was less than it could have been if the money was directed towards infrastructural development. The second biggest item in the stimulus was aid to states. So we have 50 states, of course, in the United States. And state governments, unlike the U.S. government, cannot print money. So when the tax receipts don't come in, they're in a very tough position. So they needed money from the federal government in order to continue paying teachers, firefighters, police, etc. So the second biggest part of the stimulus went to continue these payrolls. So it didn't represent any new spending, but just the maintaining of some past levels of spending at the state level. And then the smallest, or the third share of the stimulus, went to some very simple infrastructure projects. So very little was left over to invest in this. Now, when the stimulus failed to fully recover the economy, the Republican Party then pointed their fingers at the direction of the president and of the Democrats in Congress and said, aha, your policies don't work. Your stimulus did not work. You spent this massive amount of money, $800 billion. Now where is the result that you said would occur? Well, it was far better than if nothing had been done, but it was hardly sufficient to address the magnitude of the crisis. Now, the next thing that happened was that the Republican Party understood eventually that Barack Obama was a very bad negotiator. He usually started his negotiations from the position of his opponent, hoping that they would just accept what he said because he was appearing to be rational and wanting to reach out to them. The Republican Party took this as weakness. They said, aha, so you're meeting us where you think we are. Well, that's going to be the starting point. We're going to take you way down. And they did this on every negotiation. So, for instance, failing to really address properly the economic crisis in the United States, Barack Obama then moved on to health care. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because, of course, it is one of the chief reasons for this crisis that we see acting out this week with the proposed shutdown of the U.S. government. Barack Obama initially proposed a single-payer government healthcare system, as you have in Russia or Canada or the United Kingdom, Italy, etc. The Republican Party protested. So Barack Obama said, okay, how about if we just have a public option? And that means that individuals, if they want, can choose to go into a single-payer system. They don't have to. They can keep private insurance if they want, or they can go into a public option. Obama thought that he was cooperating with the Republicans. The Republicans said, no, that's no good either. So then Barack Obama said, well, how about if I give you your plan? So in 1993, the Conservative Heritage Foundation developed a plan to counter what was then healthcare reform advanced by President Bill Clinton and his spouse, Hillary Clinton, who was put in charge of this. It was called Hillary Care. And the Republican Party said, no, we have our own idea. And it's to make everyone buy private insurance. Everyone has to buy private insurance. And then what this will do is it will get rid of the free rider problem. If everyone has to buy insurance, then the costs will go down, because this means that people with no insurance, some 50 million Americans, can no longer go to hospital emergency rooms with some major health crisis, just show up and say, I don't have any insurance, but you need to fix me. That cost then gets redistributed through the entire health system. So that was the Republican plan. Now, the Republican congressman who led the last shutdown of the United States government in 1996, Newt Gingrich, a gentleman who was also run for president, failed on several occasions. In 1996, he then advanced this insurance mandate plan. Later, the Republican Mitt Romney, who ran against Barack Obama in 2012 for president, decided that he would become president by actually putting this mandated insurance plan into practice in the state that he served as governor of, Massachusetts. And so he thought this was his ticket to the presidency, to the White House. So he did this, and then Barack Obama, before the election in 2012, going back to 2009, cut him off with this idea of saying, I'll implement the Republican plan. And by 2010, the Democrats had enough votes to put it forward. Well, this was unacceptable to the Republicans. You cannot have a Democrat putting forward a Republican plan. Now you would think, well, why not? This sounds irrational. Well, that's the point. We're dealing with irrational extremists right now. They don't even really care so much about their policies as they care about power. I can't say enough bad things about them, and without exaggeration, it's like we're living out Lord of the Flies. I mean, it is just the worst possible situation. They're extremely irrational. They're vindictive. They love political games. They love to punish people. They love arresting people when they can. Every bad quality that we find in our species is embodied in this new Tea Party Republican Party, which came to power in 2010, in November of 2010. They will make any crazy argument. They will turn your words around on you. All that matters to them is a win. It reminds me somewhat of the film version of Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, where our protagonist finds himself early on in the Bolshevik Revolution, at least in terms of how the film version presents Pasternak's work, and his half-brother, who is a Chekist, looks at him and just can't believe how naive he is about what's about to happen. And this is kind of how some people in the Tea Party view Barack Obama. Barack Obama keeps saying, well, yeah, I see your point. I see what you want to do, and you're right, you have some legitimate grievances, and I really want to work with you. And they don't understand that, no, the Tea Party wants to destroy their opposition. They're not interested in cooperation. They're interested in just annihilating their opposition, who they see as somehow inherently or intrinsically evil. There's a certain kind of radical, religious, fundamentalist-like quality that's inherent in the Tea Party. In 2010, the Tea Party and these Republicans, who were somewhat demoralized by Barack Obama's political victory in 2008 when he gains the presidency, now have this kind of restored or regained confidence. They see that the American public is not going to support fully progressive policy changes. They see that Barack Obama can be bullied. And so the blood is in the water. The waters have been chummed, so to speak, and the sharks are now out to attack. And they attack. So no longer will we see any kind of stimulus at the federal level in terms of job creation. We will only see it continuing from the top with quantitative easing. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a moment if you're not familiar with it. But with regards to this issue of austerity, to return to this question, the United States has seen austerity. Again, it may not have, as I said earlier, have seen it at the same levels as we've seen in some European countries, but where it is at its worst is at the state level, the state governments. So once that stimulus money ran out from 2009, the state governments found themselves still with far too little money coming in terms of tax receipts. And these Tea Party governors, which now represent the majority of the governors in the United States, began to impose their austerity budgets. And so we've seen dramatic cuts in numbers of teachers, of those teachers who are left, Their salaries and their benefit levels have been cut. Cuts in police forces, cuts in firefighters, cuts in government services generally, cuts to infrastructure. So we see state governments that are really impoverished. And so this is taking demand out of the U.S. economy. We could have far more jobs if it was not for these Tea Party policies. Now, you might say, well, how could they spend more if they can't print money? Well, they could do what has been done recently in the state of California. As you may know, California is a very big place. It has 40 million people. And in terms of economies, if it were its own country, and who knows, given the breakup of everything that seems to be happening, maybe it will be in a few years. And it once was for 3 months, by the way. In 1848, it was its own country. They had their own flag, just as the state of Texas was its own country for 12 years. And they would like to be their own country again as well, and I hope they go. But the state of California would be the 8th largest economy in the world if it were its own country. So it has some economic power. The Democratic governor, a progressive by the name of Jerry Brown, who runs that state, did something very simple in response to the reduction of tax revenues in the state of California. He just raised taxes, and he raised them primarily on the rich. Now, of course, there is an upper limit at which you cannot continue to raise taxes because money will leave. But what Brown recognized was that after a generation of one set of tax cuts after the other, that there was plenty of movement upward to raise taxes. And so he raised them a bit. And so he wiped out this deficit that existed and the debt as well. Well, not all the debt, but the deficit at least in California in very short order. And he put California on a very stable floor in terms of its economy. So this is something that other states in the United States could easily pursue as well. Now, where I live, Wisconsin, the opposite strategy has been pursued by a Tea Party. That's what these Republican radicals call themselves. A Tea Party, a governor. They've cut taxes. And so their strategy is to euthanize, to kill government. They think that it's good to cause a crisis, because if you cause a crisis, you can further squeeze government even more. Now, they present their ideas as restoring confidence in government, restoring confidence in the economy. But if you talk with them in confidence, they will tell you that the real agenda is to destroy confidence in government and to generate one crisis after another in the hopes of killing it off, because they see government as a parasite on the economy. And of course, a bad government can be. But in many states in the United States, such as Wisconsin, where I'm from, we have a tradition of good, clean, effective, progressive government. So they're killing off government that actually has made both the government work better and therefore the private economy work better as well. And that won't do for them. That's a bad example. They're determined to create this utopia in which the state withers away. It sounds kind of anarchist, but where the state withers away, but what will be left behind are these CEOs, these chief executive officers of large corporations that kind of operate as feudal lords. And, this is a very different kind of anarchism or libertarianism than you're familiar with in Russia. It's a brand of elitist libertarianism in which people who are seen as born superior live and act as superiors to all others, and all others should obey them and follow them because it is their creativity that permits society to function. So in short, it's a very Calvinist kind of mindset. You would be very comfortable with this, say, in Switzerland in the 16th century, this worldview. It's very Calvinist. So we find ourselves now at this moment in which the Tea Party is willing to make this kind of continual war against the government and is willing to shut it down if it can. The debate is over whether or not we should continue to fund past spending. In other words, We have debts from past spending that needs to be paid, and it will be paid. But what the Tea Party wants to do is to get concessions on future spending. Now, already, the U.S. government, under Barack Obama, has made about $2 trillion in spending cuts. And, of course, I would argue that this was very mistaken on his part. Because for his first 2 years in office, he had a majority in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and he could have done what he wanted, more or less. But he gave his opposition all of these huge concessions for no reason, other than to appear as if he was reasonable and cooperative. He wanted to be this great consensus builder. He thought he could bring the whole country together. He didn't understand, and neither did I, frankly, that apparently there are many personality types that exist that are not agreeable to compromise or cooperation. I now have a greater understanding for Bolshevik methods, by the way, because I understand that you can't find total cooperation. You can't just enlighten people. There are certain people that you cannot work with. They're determined to annihilate you. So there has been an educational dimension to this crisis. So the Tea Party is out to extract even more concessions. Now, if we do this, and remember, the United States is in this very good position where it can create its own currency. And so if you know anything about modern monetary theory, this is precisely what we should be doing. Money is just a fiction. I mean, it gives us the ability, of course, to buy goods and services, but there's nothing intrinsically or inherently valuable about it. We just agree that it has value and it provides a way for us to exchange things. What we need to look at, both in the present and looking forward in terms of imagining alternative economies, is to ensure that the money supply matches the productivity level of the economy, wherever that is. And then, of course, governments want to do what they can to enhance productivity. But these Austerians, whether they are at the European Central Bank or among the Republicans in the United States, have this view that we need to cut the supply of money whenever we can, that this automatically reduces inflation, which is automatically good for the economy. And we know from both theory and, just as importantly, practice, that this is not true. During a crisis, you actually want some inflation within certain limits, and you want to get more money into the economy. It has to match the level of productivity. If you don't have enough money to match levels of productivity, then the economy stalls. And that's precisely what we've seen in the United States. It's precisely what we've seen in many parts of Europe. And so we need to break hold of this intellectual trap regarding what money is. We need better theories of money. And of course, it's the modern monetary theorists who are providing just that. Now, with regards to the future, it does seem, and referencing our meetings in Pittsburgh, China and Japan, actually, as well, referencing Andre Gunder Frank with Japan, do seem to be somewhat better placed than other countries that are currently experiencing this crisis. It doesn't mean that there are not problems, huge ones, especially for China. But China was hit later with the crisis, and Japan has responded earlier with a better set of responses than other nations. Now, I think what Giovanni Arrighi and what Andre Gunder Frank were referencing when they were talking about the rise of China, which Gunder Frank did as early as 1998 with his book Reorient, was that China was going to rise and that the Western nations were going to decline. But I think from the perspective of both, and we can argue whether we think they were correct or not, was that there kind of polycentric or multicentric world order that they would create would be more benign than the U.S. one, where the U.S., at least since the end of World War II, has kind of aggressively intervened militarily in many different places. And of course, going all the way back to the start of the United States, before it was a dominant world power, it spent a century euthanizing Indians, Native Americans, and then it spent another 50 years consistently and constantly intervening in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's not as if it wasn't doing anything abroad, although it was very smart and it stayed out of European wars, up until World War I at least. And that helped the United States become richer. So the argument of Arrighi and Gunder Frank was that, well, China's going to at least be more benign. They have this tradition extending all the way back to the Qing, if not the Ming dynasties, of managing a multicentric world order in which people want to be in it because they all benefit. Now, of course, China, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, referred to itself as the Middle Kingdom. And so that suggests that they did not see themselves as equal in this order. They saw themselves as the dominant power, but that everyone would want to embrace their order because it would still bring benefits to all others. So it's hardly perfect, but I think Arrighi and Frank thought that it presented possibilities for at least somewhat of a better system than one where the United States dominated. Now, China, of course, responded initially with a very strong stimulus program when the crisis hit, and that worked very well. So they continued modernizing their infrastructure. Now that said, even though wages have been continuing to rise in China, they're still not high enough to meet the needs of demand within their internal economy. So China is still overly reliant on an export-led economy that cannot continue to expand at its previous rates. So we can say that the United States has a kind of Ponzi finance economy. Do people know what Ponzi? Can you explain?
Explain.
Yeah, it's kind of like, well, in the late 1920s, there was this guy named Ponzi. That was his last name, his surname. And he ran an investment fund. And what he did was he built a fund based upon new investors continually cycling through and promising really high rates of return.
У нас это называется МММ.
Financial pyramid. A financial pyramid, yes? So, a financial pyramid. Now, this could be sustained as long as the new money kept coming in. Once the new money stopped growing, it had to continue growing, because as people wanted to pull their money out, if the new money wasn't coming in at greater rates, then the whole thing would collapse. So the United States, in the past 30 years, has created a finance Ponzi economy. Russia has created an energy Ponzi economy. And China has created an export Ponzi economy. So they're all Ponzi economies. They can't be sustained. They're different in their character, but the same in their essence. Now, in China, with this inability to consume more of what they produce, and this is a political choice, they're locked into this export-led economy. And of course, they've also, though, tried to have domestic demand be continued through massive property development projects, huge apartment building complexes. But this is all part of a Ponzi economy as well, because people expect to get great returns from this real estate, which will not materialize. So China has a big problem. It cannot continue as it has. Whether or not they will be able to resolve this contradiction is an open question. Japan, by contrast, responded to... They were the first country to really experience this crisis in terms of its essence. But that goes back all the way to 1991. And so they had a real estate crisis. It all crashed. And they have responded off and on ever since 1991 with Keynesian demand policies, stimulus policies. They advance them, and then they stop. They advance them again. They're worried about mounting levels of debt, which are quite high in Japan, and then they stop. But this year, they've decided that they're not going for half measures any longer. They are going to spend to the level of productivity in the economy. And so they're spending massively. And so it's too early to tell what the results will be. Now, Japan's problem is demographic. So that is the big challenge that they face. So that's where we find ourselves with this crisis. We have all these Ponzi economies. We have Japan kind of doing something interesting, but it's really too small to lead the world out of this crisis. And it, too, is very export dependent. The United States, my fear is, can kind of continue to stumble along like this for a long time. And if you would have just asked me a couple of years ago if the United States could continue like this, I would have said no. But the United States right now seems to have a bit of fool's luck. In that, of course, the United States has developed new technology for energy extraction. Fracking of rock, which is bringing all this natural gas onto the market. Horizontal drilling, where you drill down vertically and then go at a right angle. That's making all this oil available. So the United States is kind of like the Soviet Union in the 1960s. It's discovered it can rely on energy instead of innovation. So that's where the United States is right now. Now, the circumstances are a little bit different because the United States is not going to be exporting massively energy. It's going to be exporting some, largely to hurt you, Russia, which may actually help you. The United States will be liquefying its natural gas, and it will be selling it to Europe. The first places it will sell it to are the Baltic states, just to poke at the Russian government. So that will bring the prices down for natural gas, which is very bad for your energy Ponzi economy. But in some ways, this is very good, because you don't want to continue having an energy Ponzi economy. You want to develop a new kind of economy. So the United States may be actually doing you a big, big favor by forcing you to make a choice. Now, this may turn out very badly. And in the short run, it almost invariably will, right? Because, as Boris likes to know, I like to quote Winston Churchill about the United States. It was Winston Churchill used to like to say about the United States, the United States always does the right thing. And he would pause for a while and say, after exhausting all other options. So you will probably exhaust all of your other options. And then once there are none left, you will do maybe something that is better. And the same goes for the United States. That's what we will do too. See, I had thought we had exhausted all of our options in 2008. I discovered there were some bad ones left if you looked hard enough. So they're searching out all the last remaining bad options wherever they can find them. That's the stage that we're at in the crisis. The last search for bad options. I'll stop there for now.